Good morning. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's program. For those of you who are new to our programs, we will be taking questions in about 30 minutes. There's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions. Jessica DeGanzik, our Vice President of Events, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Politics Professor Dan Schnur and his weekly program, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. Hey, Dan.
Hey, Kim, how are you?
I can't believe it's March.
No, we've been doing this for almost a year. Can you believe it?
Almost. We stopped going to the office March 5th last year, so you're right. This week.
I thought this was going to go for a few weeks before people got bored with it. So what a nice tribute to our audience for joining us each week in such impressive numbers. What a compliment.
God bless our audiences, and God bless you and your wonderful program. And you have three great topics today. So let me get to those and turn this quickly over to you. The first topic, Biden versus the left. Finding common ground on minimum wage, student loans, and more. Second, he's back. Trump goes to CPAC. And third, what is Biden's plan for the Middle East? Take it away, Dan. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kim. And thanks to all of you for joining us this week for another edition of our program. I'm going to start right away with President Biden and the challenge that he's facing from the left wing of his own party on any number of fronts. Now, it's worth looking back to 2020, because during the presidential campaign, Joe Biden's campaign, his campaign advisors knew that they could afford to run to the center because they knew that the party's left wing, they knew that the Democratic left wing was so motivated to defeat Donald Trump that they'd be willing to swallow a lot of their frustrations with Biden's more traditional establishment agenda in order to make sure that they defeated Trump. And even if their hearts were with a more aggressive Sanders or Warren set of policy goals, they knew that Biden's approach would lead to the best chance of winning in November. So now it's 2021. Biden's the president, not Trump. And the divisions within the Democratic Party are beginning to come to the forefront. And while Donald Trump seems determined to start a civil war among Republicans heading into next year's midterm elections, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. There's an internal debate among Democrats is getting much louder too. So first and most notably came the split over the minimum wage increase. And we talked a little bit about this last week, but let's dig into it a little bit further here. Because when Biden first proposed his coronavirus relief bill earlier this year, one key component of that bill was his proposal to more than double the minimum wage from the current rate of $7.25 an hour up to $15 an hour. Now, progressive Democrats, who point out correctly that the wage has not been raised since 2009, were thrilled. And Republicans, most Republicans, lined up very quickly against the proposal. But of greater concern to the White House was not the Republican opposition, but a much greater concern to Biden's advisors has been the opposition from centrist Democrats. Senators Joe Manchin of West Virginia and Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona, who've already demonstrated that they're going to be a challenge for the Biden White House in a 50-50 Senate. They quickly announced their plans to vote against the minimum wage increase. But what got much less attention is no fewer than 10 of their colleagues in the Senate have withheld their signatures from a standalone bill that would raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. So if you have 50 Democrats in the Senate and 12 of those have not yet signed on to this, that's a problem for Biden. Now, as all of you know, because it's gotten an immense amount of coverage over the last several days, because legislation can only pass the Senate with 60 votes in order to prevent a filibuster, Biden decided pretty early on that using the process of reconciliation to pass the COVID-19 bill by a simple majority was preferable to agreeing to a bipartisan compromise that could attract not only Manchin and Sinema, but a sufficient number of Republican votes too. But the rules that govern the reconciliation process are very arcane and very complicated. And the rules state that a bill passed under reconciliation must have a direct budgetary impact. Now, direct budgetary impact, of course, is in the eye of the beholders. And so not surprisingly, supporters of the increase insisted that the policy did meet the requirements to be included in the reconciliation bill. And just as predictably, the proposal's opponents argued that it did not. So last Thursday night, the Senate parliamentarian to whom these decisions are delegated, a woman by the name of Elizabeth McDonough, an appointed, not an elected position, but the Senate parliamentarian ruled last Thursday night that the minimum wage increase could not be included under reconciliation, and that deprives Biden of a very key component of his relief plan. Now, technically speaking, Kamala Harris, the vice president, is also the president of the Senate's chief presiding officer. So Harris could conceivably overrule McDonough's decision to keep the minimum wage increase as part of the relief bill. But Biden's advisors, including the White House Chief of Staff Ron Klain, have made it clear that she will not. Liberals in Congress were not happy with this, but they've called for the White House to overturn the decision. They've renewed their call for a elimination of the filibuster, so any bill could pass with 51 votes. And most recently, at the end of last week and over the weekend, they called for tax penalties to be imposed against companies that wouldn't raise the minimum wage. Now, the president's advisors, and the president himself have not supported any of these alternatives. And they're now talking about putting off the minimum wage maybe until later this spring. And the Democratic base is not happy with that delay. They're not happy at all. Before we go any further in talking about the minimum wage, it seems to me, Claire, let's ask the group what they think. So what do all of you think will happen when this is all said and done? Will the minimum wage be increased to $15 an hour, as the president originally proposed and as many members of his own party still want? Will it come somewhere in between, $12 to $14 an hour, which is close to Biden's proposal, but maybe not quite there? $10 to $11 an hour, which seems to be where many of the compromise proposals are now coming in, or $8 to $9 an hour, which is a marginal, maybe even a token raise? Or will it just stay where it is? So by the end of this year, when the dust is settled, where do all of you think the minimum wage will be? Where will this call come out? Look at this. 83% of you believe the minimum wage will be raised, but not all the way to $15 an hour. Only 10% of you think Biden will get his original wish. Only 6% of you think it will stay where it is. But everyone else, far more than 3/4 of you, believe that there will be a middle ground. And as we know, Congress tends to work slowly in identifying those kind of middle grounds, so maybe it's going to take a while before we see it happen. Now, in addition to the minimum wage, there are plenty of other issues where Biden and progressives are at odds. Biden has called for comprehensive immigration reform with a pathway to citizenship for all 11 million undocumented immigrants in the country. But a lot of people on the left are very suspicious that that was just an opening proffer and that Biden will settle in their minds much too quickly for a much smaller bill that would only legalize dreamers and farm workers. And with a new crisis brewing at the border, with a large surge of immigrants and their families looking to come across into the country, the Biden administration is trying to discourage a large number of those immigrants from making the trip until new policies are in place. And they're now opening temporary centers to house unaccompanied teenagers and children, which, while are much more appointed, are uncomfortably similar to some of the facilities that were opened by the Trump administration, at least in the eyes of many progressive Democrats. And given all of this, the potential walk back on the immigration bill, the signals toward immigrants about not trying to come into this country right now, and these new facilities opening up, immigration advocates are furious. There are similar disagreements on college loan forgiveness, on campaign finance, on gun control, on police reform, on school reopenings. where these tensions are breaking out into the opening. And that's just on domestic policy. We'll talk about the Middle East later in the program, where the left has become increasingly critical of Biden as well. Now, Biden, as all of you know, it's not as if Joe Biden is a conservative. He's consistently refused calls to reduce the size of his coronavirus relief bill, fighting very hard to keep it at the $1.9 trillion figure that he originally proposed. His infrastructure proposal, which is still coming together, and his climate change agenda have immense support from rank and file Democrats. And just in the last couple of days, Biden supported an election to unionize workers at Amazon with a very, very unusual 2-minute video on behalf of the election. And some labor leaders are calling that the strongest pro-union statement that a president has made since Franklin Roosevelt. But with a 50-50 Senate and a tiny majority in the House, Biden doesn't have a lot of flexibility. He can't afford to lose very many votes on either the left or the center. Now, make no mistake, Republicans are still his most serious obstacle. And Biden will keep his party together to pass the COVID relief bill, even without the minimum wage increase. But trying to find common ground with his own party's base is a significant challenge too. Once again, we'll be eager to hear your thoughts. So Claire, if we can go to the next question. Of the many issues on which Biden and the left wing of his party are differing right now, which do you think he's most likely to find common ground and accomplish this year? Will Biden and progressive Democrats find common ground to pass immigration reform, gun control legislation, House Resolution 1 on campaign finance reform and voting rights, police reform, or none of them? Will Biden not be able to knit together a working majority on any of these policy goals this year? Let's see how optimistic our group is, Claire. 25% say none. 25% of you say he's not going to be able to pull it off on any of these issues. 42%, almost half, believe that Biden will be able to put together sufficient support and to mend fences with his party's base on immigration reform. 22%, almost a quarter, think that will happen on campaign finance and voting rights. And we'll have to come back and talk about this in the future, because there's actually a very surprising sticking point on this bill with the Congressional Black Caucus. So Jessica, maybe we can make this a topic for another day. And then much, much less optimism I see on police reform and gun control legislation, with only 8% and 3% respectively. So let's move on to our next topic. And our next topic, Kim, I have to tell you, if you're going to say it, you got to say it like they did in the old movie. He's back. I know I didn't do it that well, but you got my point. So let's talk about Donald Trump. It doesn't seem like he's gone away, has he? Well, for better or worse, Sunday was his reemergence when Donald Trump gave his first public speech since leaving office to thousands of his most loyal supporters at the annual Conservative Political Action Conference. He criticized Biden on immigration, on school reopenings, and a few other things. But his strongest statement, the sentiments, his angriest words were directed not toward Joe Biden, but rather toward the 10 House Republicans and the 7 GOP senators who voted for his impeachment last month. Now, Trump was not committal about his own plans for 2024, but he did promise to support challengers to those 17 Republicans in the midterm elections next year. And we've been talking for some time about the split in the Republican Party between Trump's strongest supporters and the more traditional conservatives, the pro-Trumpers and the pre-Trumpers, if you will. But if Donald Trump follows through on this threat, it could turn the 2022 elections into an all-out civil war within the Republican Party. Something else that was notable at the CPAC conference this weekend, there's some evidence that these grassroots activists who are so strong in their support for Donald Trump, there's some evidence that these activists are less enthusiastic about Trump running for president again. There was a straw poll taken by secret ballot at the conference, and almost 40% of the attendees said that Trump should not run for president in 2024. Now, keep in mind that this isn't all Republicans. These are voters who are predisposed toward Donald Trump. And almost 40% said that he shouldn't run again. Now, when they took a straw poll of the potential candidates, Trump won that straw poll, but only with about 55% of the vote, a much less of a margin than you might have expected, given the nature of this gathering. And in case you're interested, the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, finished second, and the governor of South Dakota, Kristi Noem, both of whom are very avowed pro-Trumpers, finished third. But the enthusiasm among convention goers, even given that conflict about whether he should run for president again or not, even so, the enthusiasm among the convention goers for Trump was just off the charts. And public opinion polls show that the overwhelming majority of Republicans still strongly approve of him. So there might be a difference of opinion about whether GOP voters want Trump as their king, but they definitely still like the idea of him as their kingmaker. And that could lead to huge amounts of internal fighting next year and all the way through the presidential election 4 years from now. Question for all of you: what do you think is going to happen next year if Trump goes to war with the traditional Republicans? If we do see contested primaries among all those Republicans who voted for impeachment, who do you think emerges victorious? Will the candidates that Trump supported win most of those primaries? Would more traditional Republicans, those who voted for the impeachment, will they survive? Or do you think it'll be a split decision without a clear-cut winner or loser as the Republican Party sorts itself out? 57% say a split decision, which is not surprising. It's tough to see a unanimous decision one way or another. But look at that. Trump supporters, by an almost 3-to-1 margin over traditional Republicans, are the ones who you think will win an inter-party contest next year. And as we'll talk about plenty over the next weeks and months, that's something that's probably not going to make Mitch McConnell, among others, all too happy. One other quick note on the CPAC conference before we move on. The policy attacks, not just from Trump, but from most of the speakers, grassroots activists, congressional members, other party leaders, the policy attacks on Biden over the course of the weekend were primarily about immigration policy and once again about the slow pace of school reopenings. But there was almost no mention over the weekend, almost no mention at all over the COVID relief bill. Now keep in mind, this is a $1.9 trillion expenditure, which traditional small government conservatives see as an immense amount of money. But Trump supporters, Trump's loyalists, didn't spend a lot of time talking about it. And I wonder if that could create a challenge next year in the midterm elections for Republican members of Congress who vote against the COVID relief bill, and a potential problem not just from the left, but maybe from the right as well. Okay, we're going to go to our third and our final topic, Biden in the Middle East. And I will apologize in advance because this is far too complicated an issue for us to cover in the kind of time that's allotted to us today. So let's agree right now that we'll come back and talk about the Middle East in more detail at some point in the not too distant future. But right away, before I get into my thoughts on it, Claire, let's start out by seeing what our group thinks. So first question, how much of a priority should the Middle East be for Biden? The top priority? Should it be one of the things on which he focuses most of his time and attention in the international sphere? A mid-level priority, somewhere important, but maybe not at the top level. Or low priority? Is it not the kind of thing that this president and this administration should be paying a great deal of attention to? Let's see what we come out with. Interesting, only 13% of you believe that the Middle East should be a top priority for the president. Almost 3/4 say mid-level, and 15% of you say a low priority. So let's go. We've asked this question before under different circumstances, but let's ask it right now, Claire, once again, as a follow-up to that previous question. We've asked you this before. Which of these foreign policy challenges is Biden's most important? On the previous question, you said that the Middle East should be a mid-level, not a high-level priority for him. Let's see where it ranks among these other issues of important international concern for the president and the country. Look at that, 85% say China. And although we did devote a segment to China just a few weeks ago, Jessica, it looks like maybe we ought to come back and talk about it again, because there's an awful lot that's been going on there that's probably not a bad idea for us to revisit. 10% say Russia, and very, very little on the rest of the world, 2% on Europe and the Middle East, 1% on Latin America. So even though it might not rank as a top level issue, it is, as we all agree, would all agree, the Middle East is a very important set of challenges for the president. So let's spend a little bit of time talking about it today before we get to our questions from all of you. So let's look back. Joe Biden's been president for about 6 weeks now. And in 6 weeks in office, he's bombed Syria, he's sanctioned Saudi Arabia, and he's taken steps to re-enter the Iran nuclear deal. So you might assume from that action that he's decided to make the Middle East a centerpiece of his foreign policy efforts. And that assumption would be incorrect. Biden sees the Middle East as a lower priority than any incoming US president in the last half a century. I mentioned last week that Biden was the first president since the end of the Cold War. Maybe a couple weeks ago, I mentioned that Biden was the first president since the end of the Cold War not to call for improved relationships with Russia upon taking office. You can probably go back to the 1960s before you find a US president who's putting less attention and less emphasis on Middle Eastern issues. And that's intentional. His advisors have made it very clear in talking to reporters on background that Biden is very deliberately sending signals to the leaders in that region that they're not a top priority for him. In his first month in office, in his first month as president, Joe Biden only called one Middle Eastern head of state. And that, of course, was the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. But even that call was delayed for about 3 weeks. And it followed calls to over a dozen other allies and even adversaries like Russia and China. Biden announced an end to U.S. support for the Saudi Arabia-led operations in Yemen in his first 2 weeks in office. He called for a freeze on arms sales to several countries in the region. And it's worth noting that his administration deliberately took a very low-key approach, even while responding militarily to the rocket attack in northern Iraq that targeted the U.S. coalition there. I'm going to offer you a quote from an unnamed Biden advisor. And this is a quote that appeared in the Politico website. Quote, "If you are going to list the regions Biden sees as a priority, the Middle East is not in the top 3. This is from a former senior national security official who was identified as a close Biden advisor. Quote continues, said it's Asia Pacific, then Europe, presumably Russia as well, and then the Russian hemisphere. And the quote concludes by saying, and that reflects a bipartisan consensus that the issues demanding our attention have changed as great power competition with Russia and China is resurgent. So let's listen to that quote again. If you're going to list the regions Biden sees as a priority, the Middle East is not in the top 3. And I will tell you, all of you, I don't think you could say that an American president since the 1960s would be able to make a similar statement. Now, the shift in energy and resources away from the Middle East reflects what Biden's advisors have described as a deliberate effort to prioritize what they think are more pressing global matters. Now, Biden's not unique in this regard. Some of his predecessors tried to extricate themselves from the Middle East, and usually unsuccessfully, because events there kept drawing them back in. But I think at the heart of the Biden approach is a sense of exasperation that US foreign policy is difficult to conduct in the Middle East, and that gets really, really frustrating. So let's take a look back at Biden himself on these issues, because the president has a very long but somewhat difficult history on Middle Eastern issues. He voted against the first Iraq War in 1991, which the US quickly won and was immensely popular. In 2003, when he was the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he not only supported, but he actively advocated for the congressional resolution authorizing George Bush to invade Iraq that year. And that's a vote he says that he now regrets. When Biden was running for president back in 2008, he proposed a plan that would partition Iraq into 3 semi-autonomous regions, one for the Shias, one for the Sunnis, and one for the Kurds, which was widely criticized by Middle Eastern experts in this country and around the world because they said it would lead to more bloodshed. So Biden has not had a particularly strong history in this part of the world, but it's not just him. His Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, isn't looking to devote a lot of time to the Middle East either. Austin just started a review of US troop deployments around the world, which is expected to reduce the US troop presence in the Gulf in order to increase it in the Asia Pacific region. At the National Security Council, the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, has downsized the size of his team devoted to the Middle East and added people instead toward the team that's working on policy in the Pacific Rim. So there are, even given that diffidence, there are issues in the Middle East demanding attention. And I'm going to mention 3 of them quickly, and then we will have to come back to them in more detail at some other point, because I really do want to make sure we get to your questions, which, as I've told you before, is my favorite part of the program at the bottom of the hour. So there are dozens of moving parts here in the Middle East, but there were 3 of particular import, which, as much as President Biden might like, he's not going to be able to ignore. And those 3 are Iran, Israel, and Saudi Arabia. All are critically important, and all are interrelated. So Biden, as it relates to Iran, has committed, as all of you know, to re-enter the nuclear agreement that the U.S. had made with that country and other major powers around the world back in the Obama administration, an agreement from which Biden withdrew. Excuse me, from which Trump withdrew. My goodness. But my own read on this is that Biden does not appear to be devoting a huge amount of effort toward re-engaging with Iran. He's saying all the right things, but it doesn't look like there's a lot of effort behind it. So why is an agreement so unlikely? Well, Iran wants all economic sanctions removed immediately before any future negotiations. Biden says the sanctions will only come off after the negotiations. The Iranian president, Rouhani, says there's no doubt that the U.S. will rejoin the agreement. But Biden's also made it clear, as has Tony Blinken, as Secretary of State, that he wants to address non-nuclear weapons and terrorism issues. And Iran says absolutely says no to that. So if Biden wants this a lot, it's going to take a long time. But if he only wants it a little, it's not going to happen. And it doesn't look like he wants it all that much. Maybe enough to keep talking about it, to keep things on a simmer in that part of the world, but not a huge amount of commitment. And we'll watch going forward to see if he decides to devote more time and attention, more serious time and effort to the negotiations than it appears to be the case so far. The second issue, of course, is Israel, and we will almost certainly need to revisit as a standalone topic down the line. But today, let's focus briefly on 2 things, and that's Israel's relationship with Arab Gulf states and the ongoing Palestinian conflict, of course. Now, for years, Israel has quietly cooperated with several countries on the Persian Gulf, mainly because of their mutual animosity toward Iran. In the last few months, before leaving office, the Trump administration made some of those relationships official as part of what's become known as the Abraham Accords. But even if just making official relationships that have already existed, this was a really historic breakthrough. And it looks like it's going to be one of the very few Trump foreign policy initiatives that Biden will not only want to continue, but to expand. Now, the big question is whether Saudi Arabia will join the Accords. And that probably has more to do with their concerns about Iran. We'll talk more about that in a little while. But it could also depend on the state of the US-Palestinian relationship. So let's talk about the Israel and the Palestinians just for a minute, knowing again that we'll come back to this issue in the future. It's tempting to believe that the stronger Israel relationships with Arab countries in the Gulf as a result of the Abraham Accords could make progress with the Palestinians less important. In other words, if Israel's forming relationships with other Arab states, is the Palestinian challenge still that big a deal? And the answer is it is, because those relationships with United Arab Emirates, with Oman and the others, those relationships can only improve up to a certain point, unless Israel and the Palestinians get back on track. Now, Biden will not be as unilaterally pro-Israel as Trump, but he'll be a lot closer to Israel than Obama was, probably closer to Bill Clinton or George W. Bush's approach, sort of an in-between, not quite as unilaterally supportive as Trump, but closer than Obama. And that will serve Biden well, either with Netanyahu or, depending on the outcome of the elections later this month, a potential Netanyahu successor. But Biden's not talking about a peace agreement between the Palestinians and the Israelis. In fact, he barely mentioned it on the campaign. It was a huge priority for most of his predecessors in the modern era. But to improve the Middle Eastern landscape overall, Biden doesn't need peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians, just signs of progress. So like on Iran, a fundamental breakthrough is unlikely, and Biden is unlikely to push hard for a large-scale breakthrough. All he needs is a little bit of progress in avoiding real problems. Finally, and then we'll go to your questions, I do want to talk for just a minute or two about Saudi Arabia, particularly given the events of the last several days, because the Biden administration's decision to release the CIA report on the death of Jamal Khashoggi, and then to announce sanctions against Saudi Arabia that did not include Prince Mohammed bin Salman for his role in the killing, has created a huge firestorm, not just here in the US and not just in the Middle East, but around the world. Now, during the campaign last year, Biden vowed to make a pariah, his word, not mine. Biden vowed to make a pariah out of Saudi Arabia because of the Khashoggi killing. But if you look back at our first two Middle Eastern topics, Iran and Israel, you can see the cross pressures that exist on candidates once they get elected. Saudi Arabia is the key to balancing off against Iran in the Middle East. Israel's relationships with the Gulf states couldn't happen without Saudi approval. Everything that the United States and its allies want to accomplish in this part of the world gets much, much more difficult, possibly impossible, unless Saudi Arabia is directly involved and strongly supportive. Now, the White House has said that the US doesn't sanction heads of state. And we saw today that sanctions against Russia that were leveled because of their handling of the dissident Navalny were directed at senior Russian officials, but not at Putin himself. And it's even more tricky when it comes to sanctions with allies with whom you have close security relationships. Now, Biden, to be fair, has pressured Saudi Arabia on other issues. On Yemen, he has ceased selling offensive weaponry to Saudi Arabia in order to end the conflict in that country. And he's pressured them significantly on human rights. But the president does seem to have decided that punishing the grandson of the founder of Saudi Arabia would have too damaging an impact on the relationship between the two countries. So years and years ago, Henry Kissinger famously coined the phrase realpolitik, which meant, in his words, in his mind, balancing between ideals and the reality on the ground and the international landscape. And the decision that Biden has made, number one, to release this classified document and to impose harsh sanctions, but to avoid imposing them against MBS himself, talks about the realpolitik that exists for any president, Republican or Democrat, in this critical region. So Jessica, I've gone a little bit longer than I normally do, and for that I apologize. But if you're still, there you are.
Hey.
But if you're willing to come back, let's see what our group has to say. What do you think?
Sure. Our first question, should the minimum wage be a federal policy given that the cost of living is so different in different states? For example, Iowa versus California.
Okay. Well, it's worth remembering that a federal minimum wage is a floor, and every state can set that minimum wage at different levels. So in fact, California has a much higher minimum wage than either the federal level or than many states do, because as the questioner correctly pointed out, the cost of living here is much greater. The state of Florida, which hasn't voted Democrat in a presidential election, I think since Bill Clinton, voted last year at the same time they were voting for Trump on the ballot. The state of Florida also voted to raise their minimum wage to $15 an hour. And there are other states, including the state of West Virginia, where Senator Manchin is from, where the cost of living is much less. So think of the minimum wage as a floor, not a ceiling, and that still does allow states and even localities to have some flexibility based on cost of living and other considerations.
Several people asking about Biden's proposal on the minimum wage and that it's going to be raised over 4 years or that it'll be gradual. Is that correct, or can you clarify that?
That is correct, and it's part of the negotiations going forward, because now that Biden's original proposal, which you just described correctly, Jessica, is no longer on the table, there are about to be negotiations between the two parties on not just how high to raise the minimum wage, but on what timeline. Senators Romney and Tom Cotton on the Republican side have proposed one potential solution. Senator Josh Hawley has proposed another, and there are no shortage of Democratic proposals as well, by Manchin to start at a $10 level, by Senator Sanders and others to get to a $15 level even more quickly. So it'll be interesting to see what the Biden administration does once the COVID relief bill is signed into law in the next couple of weeks, to how much time and attention they put into these bipartisan talks. Because like I said, if they do decide to involve themselves, we could get to the type of resolution that our group predicted earlier in the questions. And although our question talked just about the rate, the level of increase, the questioner is right to raise a question about the pace of that increase as well.
The far left is loud, but they continually vote for anything Pelosi tells them to. Do you foresee any bill where the far left would buck leadership?
I do. And we're not going to see it on the COVID bill because Democrats from the far left to, excuse the expression, the extreme center, know how important this bill is, not just for the country, but particularly for the new president. So they're not going to buck him on this. But it's, I think, very likely that on some of the bills we talked about earlier, possibly on police reform, possibly on gun control, possibly on immigration, where the most progressive voices in the Democratic caucuses decide that minimal progress in their minds is not preferable to no progress, and that they'd rather wait and push for a full victory when the time comes. So I think it's not just likely, but almost probable that the most left-leaning Democrats in Congress will find an issue or issues on which they at the very least sit on their hands and let a Biden proposal go by the wayside, rather than compromising in a way that they think is further than they're willing to go.
We have two questions that are kind of similar in nature, so I'm going to combine them. The first, aren't the splits in the Republican Party during Trump's presidency and the growing splits in the Democratic Party during Biden's presidency a healthy sign of democracy? Shouldn't we be embracing this type of civic engagement in politics? And the other questioner says, what is Professor Schnur's opinion as to the future of the traditional Republicans and centrist Democrats? Could they join together?
I'll start with the second question because it's an easier one. As you know, Jessica, over the years, I've been very skeptical of the likelihood of a third party forming in American politics. There's polling that shows immense support for a third party. But what you have to keep in mind is when you ask Americans whether they want a third party or not, every American responds based on what they think that third party ought to be. One person might want a party that's conservative on economic issues and progressive on social issues. Another voter might want one that's much more conservative on social and cultural matters and more populist on economic issues. So I think the odds are against it. That said, if Trump and his supporters do prevail by a convincing margin in next year's midterm elections, you may see a stronger effort than we've seen in the past for a third party to emerge. Because if a centrist Republican or even a more traditional conservative Republican cohort were to leave the party behind to Trump, they would almost certainly need to reach out to some of those more centrist Democrats in order to form a party that can make a real difference. Quick aside on this, and this is another topic for us to discuss, perhaps not next week, but in the future. But Congressman Don Beyer of Virginia has a fascinating proposal that would create districts with multiple representatives. The idea being that your congressional district would not just elect one man or woman, Republican or Democrat, but there would actually be a multiple number of members who came out of a district. And that way, if you have a strong environmental movement, a strong labor movement, a strong social conservative movement, a strong economic conservative movement, that each one of those factions could elect a representative to Congress. And the supposition is that in addition to eliminating the winner-take-all and often the hyper-partisan nature of Congress, that kind of multiple representation district could allow for a third party to emerge. But as long as we have single member representation, it's a real challenge. The first question, Jessica, if you can remind me, I believe it was about whether partisanship is a good or a bad thing. Is that correct?
Essentially, yes. We're seeing these divisions in the Democratic Party and in the Republican Party. Isn't that a sign of a healthy democracy?
Sure, of course it is. And it's not just the sign of a healthy democracy. In particularly, it's the sign of a healthy two-party democracy. And I think we've talked about this in weeks past, because in many other countries that operate under a parliamentary system that encourages multiple parties, everyone gets to have their own party that's much more ideologically pure. When you have a two-party system like we do, well, Dianne Feinstein and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez are part of the same party, no matter how far apart they are on many issues. The same way that Mitt Romney and Donald Trump Jr. are part of the same party, no matter how far apart they are. So the questioner is exactly right, that those kind of disagreements, either between the two parties or within the parties, are very healthy for democracy. We shouldn't agree on everything. I think where the challenge comes into play is where that partisanship or those divisions become intractable. And one of the things we've seen throughout American history, as bitter and as divisive as some of these internal fights can be, is we see that when the circumstances really do demand it, that men and women of goodwill, even if they disagree, can put aside those disagreements in order to work together. And the types of disagreements we're talking about now threaten that potential. So I would never suggest that either party should march in lockstep. There should be a healthy debate, not only between but within both parties, about the major issues of the day. But ultimately, the challenge is for those parties to come together to achieve legislative and political goals. So when we raise the questions we did in the first two segments today, it's not to criticize the disagreement, but just raise the question about whether the disagreements have become so intense that unification becomes more difficult when it's required.
I also think I saw an article this week saying that there's just been a surge in American voters identifying as independent, that they're getting further away from either party. So that could make things interesting for future elections to try to appeal to those independent voters.
Well, once again, longer conversation for another day, and I know I keep saying that because all the topics we bring up deserve more time than we have for them. But actually, Jessica, and you raise a great point, but there's been academic research done on those who identify themselves or actually register as independents. Most independents are ideologically indistinguishable on the left-right spectrum from traditional Democrats or Republicans. In other words, most self-proclaimed independents are just as liberal as most Democrats or just as conservative as most Republicans. What sets them aside is not left-right ideology, but I guess what you could call up-down ideology. Someone who describes themselves as an independent is not necessarily more moderate or centrist than a Democrat or Republican, but they're more unhappy, they're more dissatisfied, they're more angry toward politics and politicians and government. And that unhappiness and that anger has caused them to disassociate themselves from the two parties. So I refer to this, and I think some of you have heard me use the phrase before, I call this middle finger politics. Voters who are so upset that they reject the system and the two parties that are most prevalent in it. And as you correctly pointed out, Jessica, no question, the ranks of those unhappy and dissatisfied voters are rapidly growing.
This questioner asks, does the de-emphasis on the Middle East reflect America's lessening dependence on foreign oil to some degree?
It's a very smart question, and I think the supposition behind the question is a correct one. These are critical issues for the world for all sorts of reasons, but because we are less dependent on foreign sources of oil, most notably from the Middle East, doesn't mean that we can walk away, because there's all sorts of other concerns: nuclear power, terrorism, geopolitical alignments. But the lack of the immediate urgency of energy requirements does make it a little bit easier for a president to deprioritize this region. I emphasize the phrase "little bit easier." We'll see if Biden can pull it off, but the questioner's analysis is right on target. When we have those energy sources here domestically, it does relieve at least some of the urgency on the international front. Very, very smart.
This questioner asks, do you have any knowledge about how younger generations' perspectives in Iran and Saudi Arabia regarding historical conflict between the two nations?
So it's not clear from the question, and I don't know if you have any more information at hand, Jessica, is whether the questioner is referring to young people in those countries or in this country.
I'm guessing within those countries, if they're trying to find knowledge in, because I know that we've gotten feedback on like millennials or Gen Z in Saudi Arabia. We have spoken with some millennials from Iran and gotten some of their perspective. But what is I guess the sense of the younger citizens in those countries and whether they want to perpetuate the conflict?
What I've seen in the public opinion research that I've reviewed from those two countries and throughout the Middle East is a real sense of alienation among young people. They don't believe the economic and social and cultural opportunities that they deserve are available to them. And so they're much less likely to reliably support an existing power structure, whether it's the royal family in Saudi Arabia or whether it's the mullahs in Iran. And so one of the challenges going forward for the leaders of both countries is how you placate an increasingly restive younger generation that's not likely to be as accepting of the status quo as their parents and grandparents. And despite MBS's horrific role in the tragic death of Mr. Khashoggi, there is evidence that he is moving on some fronts to loosen some of those cultural restrictions in Saudi Arabia, recognizing that as this younger generation ages and becomes more influential in that nation's society, that there are going to have to be some accommodations made to them. So a real sense of dissatisfaction and restlessness creates immense domestic political challenges for both countries, often at odds with the domestic political considerations they face from the most religious communities in their two countries. So what was already a very complicated set of internal politics in these nations is becoming much more complicated as this younger generation comes of age.
This questioner asks, in hindsight, was there something to Biden's idea to partition Iraq along religious lines? In the Middle East, there still seems to be little progress to resolving so many of these ancient religious rivalries / hatreds. Why not let more of these tribes rule themselves if they want?
Okay. Well, there is an ongoing school of thought long before 2007 when Biden made his proposal, and still continuing to this day, which essentially says, if these three peoples cannot get along, why not give them each their own country, which was the thinking behind Biden's proposal back in his previous presidential run. The argument against it is that, as I understand it, is that by setting up three separate countries instead of one united, at least ostensibly united Iraq, you're almost guaranteeing ongoing warfare between those countries. And those who are most critical of Biden's proposal have essentially said, hey, look, it's not perfect by any means. It's a long way from being perfect to have these three very strong communities all at odds with each other inside of Iraq. The only thing worse is if you were to give each one of them their own army, their own economy, their own country. So I didn't intend to dismiss the argument that Biden and others have made, that the questioner asks about, but rather to point out that he received such condemnation for it, that it became one more reason for him perhaps to want to shy away from deep involvement in a region that's caused him so much, has caused him so many political problems.
Thank you. Turning back a bit to US politics, what, if anything, do you think Trump supporters want out of political leaders if Trump is not on the ticket?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and I don't have a good answer for that. Most of the speakers, at least those who were most well received at CPAC this last weekend, did not focus on specific matters of public policy. There's an excellent piece by Jonathan Martin in the New York Times on this, about how the conservative movement is focused less on matters of public policy and more on cultural and social challenges that they see as being increasingly important. So if you look at people like Governor DeSantis from Florida and Governor Nome of South Dakota, who finished behind Trump, albeit a ways behind Trump, in the straw poll, these are leaders who've also prioritized cultural matters, particularly matters relating to the coronavirus, over the last year. So both DeSantis and Nome really fought against shutdowns. They fought against mandates in their respective states. It doesn't appear that a post-Trump political movement, whether that movement comes to exist this year or next year or in 5 years, it doesn't look like matters of public policy will be as important to them as sort of the cultural dissatisfaction that many of their members feel. Two quick other points on this, and then let's move on to other questions. One pronounced exception to that is the issue of immigration, which you can argue is both a public policy and a cultural and social challenge. And the second thing I'd mention, particularly given the disposition of our group, is a movement that focuses on cultural issues rather than public policy is not unique in American history. And in fact, many of the most sustained political movements that we've seen in this country have been fueled by cultural and social concerns as opposed to policy matters. So a movement that is so reliant on Trump as an individual would have some difficulty adjusting to another leader. And Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana has warned about how a movement relies so heavily on a leader as opposed to a matter of policy principles. But I do think that sense of cultural grievance will be what drives at least this faction of the Republican Party, even if Trump himself doesn't run again.
Thank you. Do the divisions within the Democratic Party have the potential of costing them both houses of Congress?
Without any doubt. it's worth remembering that with the exception of the 2002 midterm elections, which occurred barely a year after the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001, every midterm election in the midterm era has cost the president's party some seats in Congress. And so just given history, if nothing else were to change, Democrats would be more likely than not to lose seats in both the House and the Senate. Because the 2022 House races will be run under a new set of congressional districts, and because of the level of control that Republican state legislators have in so many states, that's another consideration that makes it even more likely that Democrats will suffer some losses in next year's midterm. Does a unified party prevent those losses from taking place? No. But what we have learned in the past in both parties is the more bitter and the more divisive a primary is, the more difficult it is for a party to come back together in time for a general election. So I'm not preaching unity just for the sake of good feelings, but for those of you who do want to see the Democrats gain rather than lose seats in the House and Senate next year, I would say that a less divisive primary season is definitely in your best interest.
This will be our final question since we're at the end of the hour. Did Biden leave the China tariffs in place? If so, should he change that policy, if for no other reason than appearances?
Okay. I suspect that Biden will change that tariff, but my guess, my estimation from what I've read is that he didn't want to do it immediately. Biden has made it very clear that while he does believe the U.S. will need to more forcefully confront China in the future, that it's much more likely to be successful in that confrontation, not militarily, but whether diplomatically or economically or on human rights or even on security issues. Biden believes very strongly that confronting China one-on-one is not a recipe for success, and that it needs to be done in concert with regional and worldwide allies. We see Biden devoting a great deal of thought to the so-called Quad, the relationship between the U.S., Japan, India, and Australia. You see him working very, very hard to improve relationships with South Korea and many other countries in the region. I suppose when we see the Biden administration announce its tariff policy, I think it will do so only once they've re-strengthened some of the relationships with other regional players. So the questioner's instinct, I think, is a smart one, but the fact that he hasn't addressed the question yet doesn't mean that Biden is not going to address it, but that he'll feel much more confident addressing these types of multinational economic issues once he's had longer and more sustainable conversations with historic U.S. allies on the Pacific Rim.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dan. Thank you also to our audience for all of your great questions. I know we always have way more questions than we can get through in an hour, so we hope you'll join us next week as well. And Kim, I'll turn this back over to you.
Thank you, Jessica. As always, you're terrific.
Jessica, thank you again. And Dan, your valued insights and expertise gets us through week to week. So thank you so very much. For our viewers, we hope to reintroduce in-person events later in the year when it's safe to do so, but we're going to continue to provide these live streams for free as a public service. So please help us keep these programs going by supporting us with a donation. You can text the word Schnur appropriately today to the number in the chat on the panel on the right side of your screen. We have a terrific lineup of programs for you coming up. Just a quick review, but you can see all of these on our website. On Thursday, we have a conversation with India's ambassador to the United States. On March 5th, a members-only film screening about an Istanbul story. On March 8th, a conversation with the Crown Princess of Iran. On the 10th of March, protest and repression around the globe, a roundtable discussion on Hong Kong, Thailand, Russia, and Belarus. And on the 15th, opportunities and challenges in U.S. foreign policy. And of course, every Tuesday, at 11 o'clock, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus with Dan Schnur. And again, for those of you who would like to have more personal discussion and interaction with Dan, every other week we have a special members only after Dan's program where we can talk directly with Dan and ask questions and interact. So if you'd like to do that, please consider becoming a member. Please go to our website at lawacth.org, sign up for upcoming programs, become a member, make a donation. We appreciate everything you do. Stay safe